Our next session features Renee Myers, VP of Inclusion Strategy at Netflix, and Insider's Senior Reporter for Diversity and Inclusion, Marguerite Ward, who will have a candid conversation about what companies have learned in 2020 and will bring forward in 2021 and beyond. This session is called The Big Shift.
Welcome everyone to Workplace Evolution. My name is Marguerite Ward and I'm a senior reporter at Insider covering diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI as it's known in this space. Today we're tackling one of the most important issues American businesses and society faces, and that's how corporate leaders are tackling diversity, equity, and inclusion amidst so much change. Joining us is Netflix's VP of Inclusion Strategy, Renee Myers. Renee, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Marguerite. Thank you so much for having me.
I figured I'd change things up a little bit and throw a few lightning round questions at you, where you answer 3 or 4 questions in about 30 seconds. How does that sound?
I'll try.
All right, great. So first off, how do you feel about the state of corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion right now?
I'm feeling very encouraged. Is that short enough for you?
That's perfect. Well, what makes you feel so encouraged?
I think that for the first time, I have been doing this work for maybe 20 some years, and somehow now these concepts and the importance of these concepts have come into the mainstream. And therefore, it's everywhere in corporate America and outside.
Now, corporate leaders like yourself across the country, across the globe, have had to adapt under so much change. We've had and continue to have a global pandemic, a racial reckoning on equity in the face of the killing of George Floyd, and even political violence and instability. How has Netflix not only handled all of this, but done it while remote? How have you fostered a sense of community at Netflix?
Yeah, I think that we've done a lot of the same operational things that every company did to make their business continue and in the midst of these double pandemics. But I also think that what we did is, one, to help equip our leaders with an understanding of how to be with their teams. So everything from creating guides to having conversations, while at the same time our leaders were experiencing these things as well, right? But how do you lead in a pandemic? So we did a lot of work around that. We also had our ERGs, our employee resource groups, really create spaces for their communities and allies to just sort of come in and try to figure out how they're feeling, create space for that. We also did a number of talks throughout the company worldwide. For example, we talked about xenophobia. Which was something that came up from the pandemic. We talked about racial inequity and racial injustice. And so we were continuing the conversation about what was happening instead of trying to ignore it or push it down.
So you face things head on. Next quick fire question. What's been the biggest shift in DEI this past year?
I think the biggest shift has been the concept of systemic racism, where people are starting to recognize it's not just like, are you a good person to this person over here, or whether you have biases or not, but to recognize that there is an entire system in which we're all operating, which is unfair and systemically reinforcing biases that many of us don't even feel like we hold, but nevertheless have been embedded in systems forever and in all of our industries. And so what would it take to undo some of that?
Yeah, and part of this undoing has been the rise of so many people reading more books on diversity, equity, and inclusion, on anti-racism. Besides your books, Moving Diversity Forward and What If I Say the Wrong Thing, what other books out there should corporate leaders be checking out? Is there one that comes to mind?
Well, there's so many. So first of all, I'm like, there are no excuses anymore because there are just so many wonderful resources, and you can look at the bestsellers basically, and that's where you can find them. I have enjoyed my grandmother's hands by Resma Menaken, and it's all about racialized trauma. And in particular, when people hear racialized trauma, they may be thinking, oh, this is about how Black people or people of color have experienced trauma. It's about how all of us have, and what the impact is on our future and how we resolve things going forward. I think it was yesterday or the day before, President Biden talked about how racism is corrosive for all of us. It's not just the people who are who have the direct impact of racism, but those who are also sort of complicit in a way. So I think that that's a beautiful book, and it helps us to think about another dimension of why we can't seem to make as much progress as we would like, and it's a lot about trauma.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. One thing I wanted to circle back on is, Netflix hasn't been shy from talking about these issues around race, around trauma. What has been one of the biggest takeaways for you from having these conversations, these difficult conversations with employees?
Yeah. I think what we are learning is, we used to think that employees just come in and all of these other things that they may be experiencing is not relevant to the workplace. And I think we now know that that's just a fiction. And people have their experiences, and they come and they have their identities, and they come into the workplace, and it influences how they experience the workplace, the relationships they're having, the level of trust they have. And so how important it is for leaders in particular to be aware of these dynamics and be able to speak to them and to be courageous and to enter into some very uncomfortable conversations, but also recognizing that by doing so, they are creating the kind of inclusive and nurturing environment that allows employees to perform at their highest levels. And without it, you basically have people who are not able to feel included or a sense of belonging, or maybe they will pull back. Some folks can perform really well when they're feeling excluded, but most people need that nurturing environment in order for us to get the best from them, and for them to feel like they are part of the company and not just an undervalued member.
You hit on a really important topic that all my diversity, equity, and inclusion sources have been talking about, where the movement isn't just about diversity, it's about inclusion and equity. Can you give me an example or two of how Netflix has taken these big ideas of inclusion and equity and made them actionable, turned them into something that has had results?
Yeah. So one thing I would say is part of what we have done is committed to the long game of cultural change, which inclusion is about, which means we now have a team that is well resourced, and there are 20 people in the inclusion team, and their job is to really do a lot of coaching, a lot of creating resources and helping people through this journey. And that has made a real difference. We have also, when you talk about equity, right, that's like sort of us for the first time admitting that the playing field isn't level. And so what would it take, for example? So folks say, well, these groups are underrepresented, but there's not much we can do because they're not in the market, right? And so what would you do? So one of the things that we're doing is a HBCU boot camp with Norfolk State, where we brought in over 100 students and some faculty to actually learn aspects of, in particular, our technical business, technology, and to bring them along, give them access, give them opportunities so that they can imagine themselves in these environments, and they will be equipped to compete in these environments. So that's just one example of how do we level the playing field?
Yeah, that's a great example. And actually, we had a great question come in. Can you expand on your employee resource groups? How large are they? So tell us a little bit about maybe some of the employee resource groups, what they've done, maybe how large they are.
Yeah, sure. So we have 15 all together, and we have about over 50 chapters. So they're all over the world. And also we think that they cover about 4,000 of our employees, and we have about 8,000 plus employees who are involved, so almost half of the company. And they could be, they're like the Black group, the veteran group, the Trans-Star group, the immigration group, obviously gender, women group, family group. So there are lots of different types of employee resource groups, and their job is really, one, to create a welcoming community for those in their community, and also help around development and community give back and so on and so forth. And then they are also very helpful in providing perspectives and insights to what we do as a company. So that's a little bit about our ERGs.
And I think it goes without saying, but these ERGs have to be supported and given attention from executives and funded, right?
Yes. So one of the things that I think is important is, one, the ERGs they come about when a group of people come together and say, hey, we think we want to form this ERG. So it's not a top down thing. It's like a bottom up thing. In addition to that, we have part of the inclusion team is supportive of the ERGs. So we help them form their ERGs. We help them think about what their strategic plan is. What do they want to achieve for the year? Obviously, they have a number of events. They have certain tentpole events, plus they have events that they do all year round, and we're helpful around that. In particular, we also have executives who are allies to the group, and those executives are people who wouldn't normally be in the community. Their identity is not matched to the community, but they are allies to that community. We also have a lot of support from our talent group, so our talent acquisition, recruitment, and also our HRBPs are all embedded and part of supporting those ERGs.
Thank you for that. I think that's an awesome insight into how Netflix is actually championing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, one thing I know Netflix has been doing for a few years now is release its diversity data, diversity reports. But I know 2021 was the first year, this year, that you really laid out an awesome report and a video to go along with it. What was your biggest takeaway from releasing this official DEI report? What did you learn from the process?
Well, from the process itself is I learned how many things we were doing. I mean, initially I was like, I don't know if we're ready yet. But then we started just looking at all that we'd been doing, and we wanted to tell a story of an approach and really inspire people. So that was the exciting aspect of this is, it's about sowing seeds, and that's the name of the video. And so what we were really saying is, here's how we are trying to approach this problem or this sort of goal, right? So one, we're asking people to look at what they do through an inclusion lens, and everything and everyone in the company. The second thing is that we're putting a lot of resources in inclusion. So like we have about 20 people in the team and working across all over the place in many respects. And three, we are really trying to underscore that this is a long game. Cultural change doesn't happen overnight. The kinds of conditions that created the underrepresentation and some of the inequities, all of that is happened a long time ago and continues and has been embedded throughout society. So this is not going to change overnight because it wasn't created overnight. So we're trying to get everyone to get invested in the long game. In order to continue to see progress, we also named where we haven't been successful yet. Part of it is because so much of our company is changing so quickly. So as we move across the world, what does cultural competence look like? What does inclusion look like? What are the underrepresented groups in this country versus that country? How do we change our language? How do we work well with each other across regions and within regions? We're still working on that. And then we also called out the issue around the deep underrepresentation of Latino, Latina, Latinx folks in the U.S. in particular, which does not make a lot of sense given how well represented that population is in the United States. So there's a lot of work to do, and we wanted to signal that as well. But mostly what we heard back is deep inspiration. People need to be inspired to change. They need to know what is possible, and they need to believe, and I would say reimagine, because the thing we're trying to achieve has never happened before, where there's like a real level playing field, where there is true competition, where people aren't excluded for reasons that should never be considered. So those are the things that we're trying to do to reimagine the corporate workplace and, quite frankly, our society as a whole.
What would you tell corporate executives of smaller companies who say, well, that's Netflix. They're a big company. They have resources. I can't usher in, or I don't know where to start in ushering in change. Do you have maybe specific advice or even actions that leaders at companies should take?
So I've never heard that excuse before, that it's just Netflix and everybody, right? Never. And by the way, we're not as big as some people think. And I know really big companies who haven't put in that kind of resource and commitment. However, what I would say is you can always start somewhere. In fact, sometimes what I tell smaller companies is you're in the best position ever, because when you try to do this work with an enormous company, it's hard to turn that ship, right? And so, but when you're in a small company, you may have underrepresentation, but every conscious, intentional decision you make about expanding your network, looking carefully at your hiring, making sure that you have bias proofing techniques within your hiring, your promotion, your compensation, you can make an enormous impact very quickly, right? So maybe you start with the hiring piece. Maybe you look inside, and this happened last year. You look inside and you're like, who haven't we been developing who could quickly move into a higher position and have a leadership role? Who are we not listening to? So you can also just start doing an assessment. How well are we doing? With which groups? Where else could we improve? Where are the gaps? So I would always say you start with an assessment of your strengths and your weaknesses. You always also start, because you've got to do the diversity part. You've got to do the representation part, which means you mostly have to expand where you are looking for people. The second thing is you have to do an assessment internally. How are we doing? Who do we have in what roles? What could we change? What's right here that we could look at? And the third thing you can always do is begin the work of understanding, becoming more conscious, and developing skills around inclusion. Because all that work you do in the front to bring in people, it's not going to actually manifest real diversity and inclusion unless you are prepared for those people. And if you are bringing in difference and you haven't learned how to positively impact the company through difference, then those people are not going to find a sense of belonging, and they're not going to perform at their highest levels.
You're absolutely right that diversity without inclusion and without a focus on equity, it's just going to fall flat. It's going to fall short. What's next for the DEI movement? What are you most excited about, and where do you think the movement is going, since you're so central in it?
Yeah. So hopes. One is that people become more conversant in this whole idea of systems, and the systems outside of our industries and companies, as well as the systems that are internal, right? The entire employee life cycle has to be evaluated so that you don't keep making the same mistakes, and so that you can take advantage of, as I mentioned, the people who you are bringing in. So one of the things that people have focused on, especially really good people are sometimes the hardest to work with, because they're like, I have no problems with this. I really, really want this. But what they're not recognizing is like their own practices, or the ways in which they may be hiring themselves over and over again. So I want people to really begin, one, to examine the systems. Why is it that there's so few people, and actually do some of the things that we're doing. Like, we committed to really supporting and putting out cash in Black banks. Why? Because Black banks are the places where Black entrepreneurs go, and Black entrepreneurs are necessary to build new systems and new opportunities, so that we can also bring those or partner with those groups in our own company. So that's an external way of looking at society. Some folks are focused on education, some on healthcare. All of those things make a difference. I mean, when you think about how many kids have not been able to get educated this year, that is going to have an effect on companies and who we can hire for decades, because they have not been able to access the kind of education they would need in order to move along. And we also know in our country, education is so much focused on economics and where people live and property taxes, all of that. But I would also say that it's about a certain kind of consciousness that I'm excited about, that people are seeing these things. Now, the next piece is for folks to get skilled up. So you might see something, you may be conscious, you may be aware, that's awesome. But now what does that mean you need to do practically in the way you practice inclusion on a day-to-day basis? So my hope is that that is really the next step. I will add one more thing, which is courage. We need courageous leaders. You'll see that I say that in the inclusion report video, which is we don't need neutrality. We don't really need good people. I said that in my TED Talk too. We need proactive, anti-bias, anti-racist, courageous people who will take the steps that make a difference. Do those conversations that are really uncomfortable. Read those books that you wouldn't read. Develop the networks that are outside of your own networks. Admit when you're wrong. It's so hard. This work is so hard. No one's perfect. No one's going to be perfect. But you have to account for what you don't know when you make a mistake so that you can know.
Vernee, thank you so much for joining us. I think you've covered so much from, how you feel about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion, how Netflix specifically is ushering in change, what you learned from your report, and your hopes for the future. So again, Vernee Myers, VP of Inclusion Strategy at Netflix, thank you so much for joining Insider.
Thank you, Marguerite. It was a pleasure.